Welcome everyone to Bethesda Green's Innovation Lab Summer Speaker Series, Tackling Environmental Challenges Through Sustainable Entrepreneurship. During this series, we are discussing ideas that impact people, the planet, and profits. My name is Patty Simonton, and I'm the director of the Be Green Business Program here at Bethesda Green. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us for this, I guess not the first session of our series, but the third of our series, Considerations for Startups Applying Sustainability Principles in Their Supply Chains. I'd like to take just a minute to introduce you to our work here at Bethesda Green, which we organize under two primary categories: Be Green Business and Be Green Living. So, Be Green Living program works to elevate community engagement and enhance the quality of life for local residents. Our community projects include efforts to improve stormwater management, promote street-level community recycling, and improve access to green space, energy, and transportation. Our Environmental Leaders program supports environmental education in high school seniors, cultivating the next generation of visionary green leaders. Under our Be Green Business program, we support leaders who are building for-profit business models around innovative and sustainable solutions to tackle environmental and social challenges. As part of our B Corp program, we advise existing local businesses through B Corp certification and help them discover and implement best practices for sound governance, support for workers, and sustainability. We also welcome mission-aligned idea stage through seed stage companies to our innovation lab and have developed 4 distinct programs to provide relevant and timely support to founders, including our incubator, accelerator, residency, and amplifier programs. Applications are rolling for both our incubator and our amplifier programs, and applications will open shortly for our spring 2022 accelerator cohort. Interested founders are strongly encouraged to join our incubator as early as possible to benefit from our year-round programming. We focus on companies developing innovations in the areas of environmental sustainability and sustainable food systems. I invite anyone who is ready to join our exciting and growing community to email me at innovationlab@bethesdagreen.org if you'd like to learn more. And finally, before we jump into today's panel discussion, I'd like to acknowledge our amazing network of founders, our partners and sponsors, for believing in us and the work we do. Today, I am pleased to welcome 2 outstanding leaders in their field to share their thoughts with us today. Dr. Aurora Benton is the founder and chief change agent at Astrapto LLC, which offers courses, coaching, and consulting to advance sustainability in the workplace. She has helped over 120 young professionals launch green teams and perform sustainable procurement audits. Her clients include World Wildlife Fund, Centerplate, Baltimore Convention Center, Green Seal, the Invent Industry Council, and various hotels and restaurant groups. Aurora was part of a 2-year initiative to redesign and rewrite the Sustainable Event Standards, a sustainability certification for hotels, venues, caterers, and event planners. I'm so glad you're here, Aurora. Verena Radulovic is Vice President for Business Engagement at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where she works with businesses, policymakers, and other stakeholders to advance business action on climate mitigation and resilience and galvanize business support for ambitious, practical climate policies. She manages the Business Environmental Leadership Council, one of the largest US-based cross-sectoral groups of corporations focused on addressing climate change and supporting mandatory climate policy. Verena oversees C2ES's work on climate-related financial risk disclosure, supply chains, resilience, and the annual Climate Leadership Conference. Previously, she led the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and managed the Energy Star's consumer electronics portfolio. She developed an initiative to address potent greenhouse gases in the electronics industry supply chain, helped companies understand green power purchasing options via EPA's Green Power Partnerships, created pathways for smaller suppliers to report their GHG emissions to the US government, and helped develop industry standards for more environmentally sustainable products. I'm thrilled that both of you could join us today. Thank you both for being here. Let me stop sharing here.
Pleasure.
We'll jump right into this. I'd like to start with a few questions for each of you, and then we'll open up the conversations to questions from our attendees. Everyone is invited to share your comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A area of the chat as well. We'll aim to answer as many as we can. During today's conversation, I'd like to explore the social, environmental, and financial costs and benefits of integrating sustainability into your supply chain, or choosing not to, and how these considerations evolve as you scale up your company. So let's start with the why behind incorporating sustainability principles into your company's supply chain. Aurora, I'll toss this to you. Can you talk a little bit more about how a company's core values can be reflected in their supply chain decisions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Bethesda Green and Patty. Always a pleasure interacting with you. So to me, I have trained people who work in organizations from one person shops just getting started to people who work at global franchise, locations. And one of the things that's pretty consistent, but particularly as you scale and you get larger, is your staff and your organization, right? You bring people in and your customers, really selling them on your core values. And when they pick up on a disconnect, it's like a little teeny tiny you know, splinter that gets in your skin. You almost can't see it, but it drives you crazy and it hurts. And that is what happens when people have a disconnect in their sustainability programs and the implementation of it, the communication of it. So if we say our core values are XYZ related to social or environmental impact, yet what we're living out on a daily basis does not support that. A lot of staff and customers still are very green, pardon the pun, when it comes to understanding and knowing what to look for. But they have like an intuitive sense and they'll pick up on it when they see that disconnect. And of course, eventually you could get really called out for greenwashing, or, we've all heard some of the really, big scandals of where these things do end up becoming a problem. But I think from a very early stage, figuring out what those core values are and understanding how they manifest in supply chains and recognizing that you're not going to have a perfect supply chain that's going to hit on all those points. So how are you going to maybe tweak or retool those core values so that they align with what's practical with where you're at, and maybe your vision can expand over time. But that also is really helpful, especially for smaller businesses, because if you are, let's say, you discover 5 things in your supply chain that you'd really like to fix, newer materials, certified organic, whatever, and they all come with additional cost. Trying to do the math to do that business case gets messy fast. You probably don't even have the bandwidth to get all the data you need to do that. But if you just focused on one and fixed one and put all your energy around how to innovate that one and tackle the one, then let that one be driven by your core values and fix that one and have a great story to tell with a lot of splash. And then you can move on and solve others.
Awesome, thank you. And, we're going to get into a little bit about, some of the differences that small companies, the differences between big companies and small companies and how they tackle a lot of these supply chain issues. And Verena, I know you'll be able to speak from that perspective. And we'll dive into that a little bit in more detail later. But first, I kind of want to ask you, Verena, are the companies that need to act doing enough, fast enough to address the problems our planet is facing?
Oh my gosh, that is like a 4-hour question. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to come speak. I'm really happy to be here, and I think it's a really important topic, and I love seeing companies of all sizes that are interested in this issue. The short answer of it is some companies, yes, and some companies, no, but holistically and collectively as a sector, the business community as a whole, from small to large, the answer is there's always room for improvement. And I think that we can look to, what the Fortune 500 leading companies are doing when we think about scale, or we think about the opportunity for impact, or we think about like really hard to decarbonize sectors and what they're really trying to do, all the way down to what a small business can do. Everyone can do their part. So what I'd love to do is the short answer of it is no. Although I can think of a couple of examples of companies that are really doing wonderful things. But I'd love to kind of dive into some of the details of that and really kind of position and help smaller companies think through how they can be competitive in a decarbonized future.
Great. Okay. Well, I look forward to getting that soon. To set the stage for that conversation, Aurora, who should be responsible for the waste that products create?
Everyone. Everyone in the whole supply chain, right? So there's a lot of opportunity, but it requires some out of the box thinking. Oh, I love that. That's a great pun for the story that I would like to tell to sort of demonstrate this. So one of the students in one of my courses, one of my online courses, is about starting green teams. She did really a green team of like 2, because she was working in this small retail shop inside. It was like a gift shop inside of a hotel, very eco-forward, eco-friendly, small. I think they had maybe 3 or 4 locations. And she was working in one of them, and she was observing different things that she could do. And a couple of things that she observed was, for example, some products they sell, when customers would find out they were made of plastic, they said, oh, they changed their mind. And she actually did some math to figure out what they were losing in sales by sourcing a product made of plastic instead of some other material. But one of the things that she did that I just think was so cool, they bought this sunscreen, an environmentally friendly, like coral friendly kind of sunscreen, and she would take it out of the boxes and stock it on the shelves. And she noticed that it came boxed inside of a box, inside of a box. And there was just this excess, like why is this necessary? She called the manufacturer and said to them, hey, I don't really feel like this extra box is necessary. It's not branded. It's not, there's nothing, it's just cardboard. And they agreed to ship the sunscreen without the extra layer of boxes. Imagine the cost savings, just even for that sunscreen manufacturer. And what I think is so critical about this is that is already an environmentally forward company. And it's easy to assume that if you have a particular ethos around a social environmental issue, that you must be checking all the boxes. Well, surely you must have already figured all this out. Like we worked with small businesses and even global companies. We know that's not possible, right? There's this sort of copy paste mentality, or if you outsource to a manufacturer that just does what they've always done. Our customers have always asked us to put the sunscreen inside of a box. So that's just what we do, right? So it really takes every person along the way feeling empowered, and that's something you can bake into your culture early on, that every level of the organization and everyone involved in every part of the supply chain can be empowered to say, do we really need that? Or why is it that we do it this way? And that they're not going to get their wrists slapped or to feel like they've stepped on someone's toes, which is, a lot of times the reason people don't speak up when they see opportunities for improvement. So I think it starts at the top with a strategy, but also setting a culture that allows people to speak up when they see these things and to innovate and present ideas. But it also means everyone working collectively in a supply chain and getting that information and data feedback. Another quick example is I ordered a little box of vitamins once through Amazon, and it came in a box inside of a box. I mean, it was literally, this box of vitamins came in a box this big. I don't know if you can see my hands on the screen, and it was like, okay, I'm sure the maker of that vitamin's very eco, very like super sustainability brand. I bet they have no idea that when their stuff is being ordered through Amazon, this is how it's arriving at my house. So how can they get data and feedback from their channels to be able to understand where they might be able to have some influence in that?
Yeah. And Verena, I'm interested in your take on that question as well, because there's part of me that also wants to tweak it a little bit beyond who should be responsible for the waste the products create to, adding a price tag to that responsibility, and kind of acknowledging that we're all paying for the trash that we collectively create and that manufacturers create. And there's some I'll see on, social media that blame manufacturers. They're like, manufacturers essentially make stuff so that we can all fight amongst ourselves about how good or bad something is. And then, shame someone for buying a particular product over another product, when in reality, it's like, it should never have been made in the first place, right? One would think. So what's your take on that?
That's a great question. So I think building on Dr. Aurora's point, when we think about like all the different incentives and all the different like touch points where companies make decisions, I'll note the one dynamic that I've seen often in companies is that sometimes there's a disconnect between the sustainability team's sourcing of products, and a disconnect between those that are making packaging decisions. So if you think about like a giant warehouse, or if you think about, and I have also actually had, sorry, there's an alarm outside. I've had like, I think it was one small package developed to me, like a little backpack that was in a box that was like 5 feet by like 3 feet. And I was like, wow. But I think that like when you don't have alignment internally across the procurement divisions, across the sourcing divisions, that happens all the time. And so what happens when the consumer experiences this, they're like, I don't get it. Like I bought the most eco-friendly something, and then it comes to me like 6 times wrapped around. It's because of the lack of alignment that's happening across the value chain within the company, and then from the way that it sources its packaging. And so that's really important, that you have that alignment across a company so that the end consumer has this collective experience and has a congruent experience. So as was mentioned earlier, if there's something in like a splinter in your finger where you're like, this feels kind of odd, that's an example of that. One thing about producer responsibility that I think is really interesting is that over the last 15, 20 years, the concept of extended producer responsibility has been out there. And from my experience, it's been working with the electronics sector. And there was always this thinking that like, if companies internalize the cost of having to then take back their products, they will design them differently. And it really hasn't been until the concept of circularity, which is really kind of reduce, reuse, recycle, but just repackaged in a much more, I think, exciting way, where companies are really thinking through like where and how their products can be leveraged in a broader ecosystem of recycling and renewal. Because after experimenting with take back, or after experimenting with recycling programs, I think what companies have come to a collective understanding that it doesn't necessarily make economic sense for them to take back their stuff, because when it gets widely dispersed in society, it sometimes is difficult. And sometimes technology or materials change. Think about what's in your computer today versus what it was made out of 5 years ago. It's a very different product. But if we think about how can those systems that are out there in the world make use of those materials and sort of what they call open loop concepts, that is a really where a lot of companies are going. And what that means is a direct engagement with the infrastructure that we have at the municipal level, which up until now is underfunded. Well, in some cases it still is, but like really what does that infrastructure look like that can be part of a broader ecosystem? And it becomes really interesting when you think about the role of companies and how they can advance public policy solutions. I know there's been a lot of discussion among companies around, the infrastructure of recycling, because at the end of the day, how do you sort of make sure these materials flow through in circular ways and don't end up in the landfill?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, Aurora, when we spoke before on the idea of, really understanding the full product life cycle, especially smaller companies, life cycle analyses are really expensive. I had a founder ask me about it, just this week, and I believe they're about 50, 60K or something. I mean, they're not something you're doing as a, bootstrapping startup. What are some other ways that you would encourage founders or of growing companies to kind of tackle that effort? How can they get a better grip of what's involved?
I think honestly, to me, it feels a little bit like when you ask about life cycle analysis and you're talking about organizations, even social enterprises or B Corps, right? You're talking about smaller, like maybe less mature organizations, and you're talking about LCAs. It's almost like saying like, how do I get my PhD, but I haven't finished high school yet, right? I feel like a lot of what companies need to do is like step back and scale it down. Just do some basic research on your supply chains. Just start with, in fact, if you've got a small team, here's one of the best things you can do. You can ask each member of your team, regardless of what they do or what their education level is, once a week, set aside some time to ask everyone, give them a little guidance if they need it. Ask everyone to bring in some piece of research on something in your supply chain. Whether it's a forest where a particular tree comes from, whether it's what's happening with chocolate in Africa, whether it's, will this research a particular country where our products are manufactured. Now, that doesn't mean that our manufacturer is doing this, but let's find out what's happening with general textile manufacturing in China, or research. Because if you're a smaller business, the challenge for you in the supply chain is the power dynamic. You don't have the money or the size to compete with the global corporations. And when it comes to supply chains, your downstream, your upstream supply chain, your competitors are not the same competitors in the downstream. So you might be on a shelf next to another competitor, but the person who's trying to get that same renewable material packaging could be a healthcare company or an auto manufacturer, someone else who's trying to get the same access to the same materials, but for different applications. And now all of a sudden, the global competitive marketplace for these new sustainable materials is just, it's going, it's crazy. And what I hear from a lot of smaller companies is, I can't compete. I can't do order sizes enough to get organic milk because the big companies are all taking it, right? You hear these things all the time. Okay, so the power dynamics are not in your favor, but knowledge is power. Know everything you can about your supply chains, because just like the same networking and serendipity that got you to the place you are now as a small and growing business, that same dynamic can happen when you're having a conversation with an investor and you can articulate crisply and quickly, here's a problem in my supply chain I can't fix. Oh, just so happens that investor is investing in one of the technologies you need. We know that's how entrepreneurship works, right? It's so much, it's 99% serendipity and 1% work, if we really are really honest about it, right? Being in the right place at the right time. But when you're in that right place in front of that right person, where a partnership could really be ripe and interesting joint ventures and things like that, are you ready to know what to ask? And you won't be if you don't thoroughly research your supply chains as much as you can. And you don't need a doctorate to do it. You just need a Google or your favorite search engine, and start there. Don't overthink it. Just learn, and then take it from there.
Yeah. Whew. It's daunting to even think about all of that. You can see why some of those life cycle analyses would have a price tag like that, because at some point you got to outsource it, if depending on how complex it is and what's really involved. And I imagine also for the certification component of it, right, that if you do want to have that certified supply chain through and through, that it has to be an outside body doing that. But I would imagine that investors who are aligned with what you're doing would probably be okay paying for that, if it's something that they value and they think it's worth in terms of what you're doing.
And that's critical. I'm glad you said that, because I when I'm trying to promote people to do certifications or to shop by certification, I remind them, listen, you're going to pay more for that product because they've done all that validation and research so that you don't have to. They have taken a huge lift off your hands. So you need to be comfortable with paying a little bit of a premium, because that's the value they add in having done that process.
Yeah. We'll see how many consumers actually do that. Verena, I'm going to toss this to you. And building off of the idea, Aurora talked about the upstream and downstream of supply chains, and, small companies. You're just not competing with the big ones. And your background is mostly with these Fortune 500 companies. And a lot of them really are responsible for much of the world's emissions. You've talked about how smaller companies don't necessarily have an environmental footprint on an individual level, like they're just not that big, but that their choices can impact the overall value chain. Can you talk a little bit more about how companies at all sizes might interact with each other to make the supply chains more sustainable throughout?
So I'll break that down into two answers. One, in terms of the individual impact that a company can have writ large, and what that means for a broader supply chain, and then how they can interact with one another. So as was mentioned, I'm hearkening back to an experience that I've had kind of intermittently throughout the last 10 years at EPA, and I see it now also in my current role and I really commend when smaller companies really want to make an impact. We always think, yes, you should absolutely, do something at an individual level. A company's contribution to whether it's electricity on the grid or fleets, that's where a lot of companies' impacts lie. It's their electricity bill, or it is going to be the cars that they drive or the airline emissions from the business travel they fly. And collectively, that's a small drop. But what is really powerful is that imagine if like, hundreds of thousands of small businesses across the United States were beginning to ask their utility for renewable energy options or to take advantage of some of the renewable energy offerings that they often might get flyers for and be like, oh, is this legit? I don't know if this is like a scam or if this is like a program. But if you focus your efforts on the area where you can have the most impact. And one thing I know that was dropped into the meeting description was the EPA's small greenhouse gas footprint calculator. That was something that my former teammates and I worked on at EPA. And it's really meant to be an easy to use tool where you can plug in and figure out, like, generally speaking, where are my biggest impacts? It's most likely going to be your electricity bill. So at an individual level, as we think about this much broader transition in our society that is needed, where if you can imagine that every utility would have, 50% of their, the generation that they buy and distribute across their distribution lines would be coming from renewable energy, or 80% or more, what would that look like? And having that consumer demand is an important thing to get that started. So if every small business in a community was asking for renewable energy options or voluntary green power options, which is different from the regulatory requirements that the bare minimum that utilities must meet, that's powerful. So I think don't underestimate that. And that's an important way of thinking through, especially as you, as small businesses, want to communicate to their customers where and how they are having the lowest impact. That is an important area where they can truly take control and have an impact. And then when you sort of plug into the interaction with corporations, companies, the power dynamics between across supply chains is vast and wide. I mean, let's say like a giant company that you think has a lot of clout might be one customer out of hundreds of a supplier that might be based overseas. And so even though that company might be a big company, in terms of its influence throughout the supply chain, it may not have a lot of influence. In the experience that I've had working with the electronics sector, where you have one very large company based overseas and all 7 major brands of electronics, brands are asking for them to reduce their emissions, not just 1, but 7, then all of a sudden you can really begin to affect change. I think what's important is that, especially for smaller companies that are within the value chain, a lot of Fortune 500 companies are looking for ways to reduce their supply chain emissions across the board. And depending on where you are in that supply chain, even though you might be a smaller company, if you represent a particular, value to that particular corporation, or if you happen to be providing them with a widget or a product or an ingredient that is represents, a majority of their spend for that thing, then you become important in terms of being able to say, hey, I've also reduced my carbon footprint to the best extent that I can. And that allows the Fortune 500 company, the large company, to say, okay, great. Like, you might be a more valued supplier because I don't have to worry about you. A lot of companies have set supply chain targets. So things that are out of their control, but trying to find ways to work with their suppliers to reduce their emissions. And some companies have taken direct responsibility for this by helping to finance and fund their suppliers to buy renewable energy, or to find, in the agricultural space, for example, to sort of develop regenerative ag practices that can be sort of all the way down to the farm. But if you're already kind of taking care of your shop, that is a real big win for a lot of companies, particularly for companies that are not necessarily taking it upon themselves to help their suppliers reduce emissions, but instead, some companies are saying, here are the principles we'd like you to meet. Let us know when you've met them. And so if you're already ahead of the curve and taking steps to reduce your own carbon footprint, then you are in a competitive position to those companies that are looking to decarbonize their supply chains.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot kind of coming down the pipeline, be it regulations or more pressure coming from consumers, kind of demanding these kind of, activities from the companies that they buy from. And so, yeah, I can definitely see that as a smaller company, if you're looking to be a supplier, to get in there, make it happen. I see a question from Nathaniel that actually will bring us over to a topic around packaging that I might as well we can get to now. Nathaniel asks whether or not either of you have suggestions for companies that sell renewable bottles for selling biofertilizer. They're currently using pint and gallon black plastic bottles. but are interested in getting away from that. And, you know, Aurora, I'm gonna toss this to you first. You and I have spoken in the past about bioplastics as a whole and how in some ways they're kind of gumming up the whole system. Can you maybe expand a little bit on that? And if you can, try to offer a suggestion.
Yeah, I don't know if we may have to revisit Nathaniel's question to make sure I'm actually addressing it. Fertilizer is something I'm not as familiar with, other than just some of the sort of high level like negatives. But so let's come back to that to make sure we can cover it if we didn't get to it. So the way I would love to set this up is to follow up on something Verena said earlier that I love, which is every step counts. Every little company doing every little thing, it matters. And one of the ways you can really help smaller businesses see that is to help them do some math. So a great example of this is I was working with a restaurant a couple of years ago that they already had a very sort of, sustainability mindset, and they were wanting to really, really manifest that in their operations. So they were using plastic clamshells for their to-go items. They had 4 restaurants, and they wanted to look into better, like rapidly renewable materials, compostable, something like that. So I did some research. I researched the local composting, the local infrastructure for recycling in their community, and I asked to see their orders, their purchase orders, or their database of all the food service to-go items they had purchased that year. So I was presenting this in September. I computed everything up through the end of August. And it did not need to be scientific. This isn't a precision thing. This is just get a good enough number to make the jaws drop. And what I did is I showed them, and this is a company that's already like, hey, we want to explore this. I mean, they're paying me to do this work, right? I showed them that because of the recycling situation in their community and the like general recycling rates of plastic globally and in their area, that they had probably were responsible for 20,000 pounds of plastic just in one category of their to-go items. Like I didn't even look at some of their catering business, and just basic clamshell to-goes, 20,000 pounds of plastic for 4 restaurants. And that was not even the full year, right? That was January through August. That was like, it was like, let me just take a moment for the pen to drop. And everybody did, like the room was just, and because there were people in the room that were not the key decision makers, people who work line cooks and other people, it was just like, it was great to have everyone have this collective, like, and so it's a small business, but what a massive impact, right? What a way to really show that every little bit counts. And so just in general with plastics, we need to be thinking this way. We need to be doing the math and really thinking about just how much plastics we're sending. Globally, the statistics range, but it's between like 9 and 20% recycle rate of plastics globally. That's pathetic, right? That's really bad. Okay, so bioplastics. So now, given that situation, there's been a plethora of solutions to come into the market: compostables, biodegradables, bioplastics, and all this stuff. There's still a ton of confusion around what these things mean, where they go, how they're made, the chemicals in them. And so my concern is that people kind of think of bioplastics like a get out of jail free card. And as long as I switch to a compostable or a bioplastic, I don't have to worry anymore about how much plastic I'm using. We still need to step back and think about consumption overall. We still need to have that sort of rethink, source reduction moment around all of these things. The thing you have to understand about waste is it is so super contextual. You can't make a global solution for this. I live in a community that doesn't even have curbside recycling. I put my recycling in my trunk and drive it an hour to a town to recycle it. They won't take bioplastics. Their facilities nearby can't handle the bioplastics, right? If you're going to compost it, it has to go into exactly the right facility with the right conditions. So you end up with these what ifs to the nth degree when you introduce some of these new materials. So let me just say this: don't get so frozen in like deer in the headlights of like, I can't make a right decision. I mean, my gosh, I can't even, like, well, what's the right choice? I'm sorry that there isn't a good and perfect and right choice. Reusables obviously are a great step in the right direction, managed correctly. So it's really about understanding like what your dynamic is. If you're running an event and you have control over the garbage, because most people are going to consume the item and throw the garbage right there in your control, and you can have people who sort the trash and all that, then go for it. Do that. If it's going out into the world all over the place, it might help you to understand whether your customers are recycling at home. Do they live in cities that tend to have facilities that handle bioplastics? Do they even understand the difference? Right? So I would say just be careful about thinking of these things as the free pass. Sometimes at best, they're the lesser of evils, but at least a little bit of a step in the right direction. So hopefully that helps a little bit with the question that was posed.
No, I think it does. And, I'm interested if you wanted to jump in with regard to the biofertilizer, what are the concerns that you have? Is it because of like what's actually in the material that responds to like, could you ship that in
Right.
metal?
So I think, again, I think that's a great example of like, you need a lot more information to understand, right? So fertilizer just in and of itself, there's organic fertilizer that's wonderful, and then there's non-organic and toxic fertilizer. So what is in it? And if it's so bio-based, I'm assuming that's all, plant-based materials, but the wording for bio-based is really like who's regulating the phrasing and the terminology that's being used there? Because that also plays into it. One of the reasons we have so much confusion around like bioplastics is there's not a lot of regulation, right? There's some certifications that help, but not a ton of regulation that really helps us with this yet, right? Hopefully we'll get there. So for fertilizer, I'm not, what else is being added? Where is it being produced? Does it mess with the ecosystem and the biodiversity of the area where you're applying it? So, I'm not sure.
He is saying that it is, and Verena, I want to jump back to this, but while we're on this topic, so he is saying that the product is plant-based and organic. It's, it's algae-based. He's curious whether or not there are cardboard type bottles or would glass bottles work better? I mean,
for distribution,
for transport, and, taking into consideration weight and breakability and things like that, like how does that, what are some of the factors?
Yeah, and actually I think one of the biggest factors you have to consider is anything that might have any sort of liquid or moisture content, which I'm assuming probably this does, is even if it's in a wonderful cardboard box, it is most likely going to be PLA lined. Right. So now you're talking about a chemical, although there's some really interesting new technologies that are coming about with packaging so that the linings are bio-based and trying to get away from the PLA and things like that. So probably I'm just about at the limit of my technical expertise on this, so I'm not going to put myself out there as anybody who knows more than that. I would just say that there's probably not the perfect solution other than maybe perhaps a packaging take back program, and that depends on your distribution channels, whether you're B2B, B2C, like Verena was saying earlier, the logistics of that aren't realistic. But yeah, I think this is where you have an opportunity to maybe partner with some other startups who want to pilot some technologies around sort of liquid containment in a sustainable way. And you're small and nimble and they're small and nimble, and you should work together to see if you can't figure out sort of that, like magic moment.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I heard about a company recently that, well, you've seen it, different types of it with, detergents that are now single, like thin sheets, right? So you're not getting detergent in the big plastic bins anymore. You're getting these thin sheets that just dissolve in water, and, the toothpaste pellets and things like that. You can get all kinds of just, lighter and different ways of producing things. Verena, I want to pivot the conversation a little bit back to the why, and in some ways kind of, and thinking about kind of how, companies engage up and down their supply chain and what matters to them, especially, as they're growing. I mean, our audience really are currently small, rapidly growing companies, but their plan is to grow and to have, substantial impact as they grow. Can you tell me a little bit more about why a company would want to care enough about measuring and disclosing the choices that they're making around sustainability, and recognizing that the climate risk and how we're all sort of working to address that is a factor in our decisions. I'll let you kind of build on that, but I know it's a messy question, but I'm hoping you can run with that.
I think the short answer of it is that to be a competitive supplier. When we look at where companies are going, for most companies that are large, but even small, things like measuring and understanding their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is becoming commonplace. I remember I was about a year and a half ago, I was at the Outdoor Industry Association, which is sort of all the suppliers to REI. It was were there. And these were sort of small and medium-sized companies, US companies that had extensive supply chains in other countries to make their products, but some of them were making products that were in the US. And I remember the president of the CEO of REI was using the word scope 3 emissions. And I was like, and I remember the word scope 3 emissions appeared in a Washington Post article on sustainable fashion without like a disclaimer of what that was. I was like, no one knows what that is. But the fact that this lexicon is happening in whether it's in corporate C-suite boards or in newspaper articles, and particularly there's so much attention going on with the Conference of Parties after the Paris Agreement. The new Conference of Parties is going to be coming up in Glasgow this November, where countries are going to be committing to more hopefully reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the role of the corporate sector. So if we think about impact, it's like if you want to be tracking with the trends of where larger companies that are under the microscope of their shareholders and under regulators and customers, like big customer facing brands, that broader awareness is just happening kind of in our news, in our public awareness. And I think positioning yourself as a company to also be part of that conversation is just part of that, keeping up with the trends of what does it mean to be a sustainable company. It doesn't mean you have to do everything. I mean, if you're Amazon or Microsoft, there are 19 different ways that you can be reducing your carbon footprint. If you are a maker of a particular component, or if you are, an ingredient provider, or you're, creating a sustainable food company, what's the one thing that you can do to reduce your impacts? And you can still credibly be part of that broader conversation and understand where that impact can be done really well. There's a collaborative, I think it's called the Climate Collaborative, that has over 750 companies that are in the natural food space. Think about that, like 750 companies that are primarily US-based companies that are in the natural food space. The supply chains, you might be having similar supply chains to what, a large retailer or grocery brand might be having. And what if all 750 brands banded together and demanded better ag practices in concert with that large retailer? So again, never underestimating the power that you may have if you are acting alone or acting in concert, or it provides the space to collaborate and have a broader societal impact. When it comes to financial risk, this is a new and emerging field where companies that have had, I think it was the example of trying to going from getting your GED to getting your PhD really fast. As companies get comfortable with understanding their carbon footprint, in terms of where it's measured and what steps they can take to reduce it, that is within their control. Big companies are being asked to disclose, how are they going to transition to a decarbonized future? How are they addressing their climate-related risk, physical risk? So you can think about companies that have factories in typhoon or monsoon or flood plains. If you think about agricultural companies that are experiencing drought now as a result of climate change. So, and then if you think about transition plans, like if you have regulations that are going to move companies to a decarbonized future, and if you have not changed the way that you're doing business, if you're still going to be producing internal combustion engines, to no end, or if you're still going to be producing coal-fired power generation, you're not competitive for a future that needs to be net zero by 2050. And so again, whereas a small company may not necessarily be asked by its privately held stakeholders, or even if it goes public, but to be aligned with and in step with where the larger trend is going is important, I think, as a signal to your customers, but also as there's knowledge that's out there in terms of how companies can understand their risk use it. Like find ways to identify, hey, is there maybe, in my supply chain, am I sourcing from a part of the country that is vulnerable? Because that's going to affect my bottom line in my business. And I may not have, the financial wherewithal to withstand a drought or an inability to provide me with things that I need. So I think taking time as this field is growing to understand what it means to measure your climate risk, whether it's, physical risk from climate change impacts, which are not going away tomorrow, or looking ahead at what the transition risks, the political risks, the investor, pressure and customer changes, and seeing kind of where you want to be in that conversation. There's a lot that companies can learn, even if they themselves don't take action directly. I think understanding where to position oneself is, from a financial health perspective and from a competitiveness perspective, I think that's something that is going to become even more important as time goes on.
Patty, can I build on that with something
Absolutely.
real quick? So in the Green Team course that I run, I don't track the data on this, but I ask the participants when we do the business case section. One of the business case categories is risk and compliance. And one of the basic questions, I give them all like a list of questions, like ask yourself this about your business. And one of them is, what's the safety plan? Just the safety plan. I mean, we're not talking about financial risk and disclosure, just the safety plan. The vast majority of them will say, and they work mostly for small and medium businesses or franchised businesses. The vast majority of them say, I have no idea what my employer safety plan is, and I've never been trained on it. The vast majority of them have no idea. So we're talking about you don't even have your ducks in a row for your own physical location safety plan. That's an indicator that probably, you've got a bigger mess on your hands, right? So I think that there's a culture of care and attention to detail that comes along with what Verena's saying, right? It has to permeate everything, which means there has to be accountability. And as a startup or small business, you can bake that in early. Add it to job descriptions now, not 5 years from now when you dream of being the business you want to be. Build it in now. Build it into your RFPs now. Build it into performance reviews now. You can bake those things in very early, and then it won't be so hard to like suddenly fill in the gaps when somebody comes to audit you or you have to comply for that larger corporate business.
Yeah. So inspiring, right? Just getting like, it is possible, right? Like there are steps that founders can take to do that. I want to kind of toss it out to our participants here. Please type any questions you have. I have one more question for both of our panelists here. And, I encourage you to add and ask away here. What are some of the examples that you've encountered in your work? We've talked about thinking about packaging. We've talked about, incorporating values into the way you do business. We've talked about kind of reporting and just recognizing the role that, climate change can have on your supply chain and being aware of some of the challenges there. What are some of the maybe, surprising ways that founders really of companies of all sizes can think about, can apply today to make what they're doing more responsible and more sustainable?
Well, I'll just pick up on the theme that I was just talking about, which is attention to detail. I will tell you that I feel like almost every day I learn something new that I'm like, oh, I never knew that. Like I have a doctorate degree, but I mean, really, it means nothing. I learn new stuff every day, and I learn stuff from people who, aren't even educated in this. Just happen to have a passion, happen to read a blog, happen to talk to a neighbor, whatever. Like, oh, I didn't even know that, right? So just recognizing the fact that you will never be an expert on this, so don't even try. just build a team that is interested in learning and recognizing the fact that you will learn new things that will shock you. And just be, when you find out that most of the olive oil supply in the world is diluted and fake. What, really? but also, just take it all in stride, solve the problems you can, try to be knowledgeable and learn. Like when I hear something like that, I'm always like, well, let me do some research. Like, is there a study that shows like how much, what's the percentage of olive oil that's diluted? Where is it coming from? Like, just always ask why, always kind of question things. And remember that things are changing all the time. I was just having pizza with some family the other day, and I always take their recyclables home because I'm the only one in my family, my extended family, that recycles. So I'll put it all in my car and take it to the various places. Because again, we don't have curbside here. And so I did a quick search. I was like, I remember seeing something recently that you can now recycle greasy pizza boxes. I remember forever you couldn't recycle pizza boxes because of the grease. Well, now there's some study that came out that's like, no, that's not true. You can recycle a pizza box that's greasy. So just keep in mind, and I fall into this trap too, that you'll never know everything. Like, research it, learn, and have a very open mind about how fluid all of this is. Don't let it get you down. Just ride the wave and try to, get in the flow and just do your best to always stay knowledgeable about these things.
Verena, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I would say, so I guess I'll build on what Aurora is saying. I really think that so there are two things. One, I think, get an understanding of where your impacts lie and really thinking through the full value chain. So like I said, for most companies, it's going to be their electricity, it's going to be their transportation or their business travel when it comes to their carbon emissions. What is harder to understand is the life cycle emissions more broadly, and when you're looking at other environmental impacts. And so, but nonetheless, there are ways and tools out there that can help you understand that. And I should just premise, I realize that in the course of this entire conversation, I've been coming at it with a lens of greenhouse gas emissions, because greenhouse gas emissions are in everything of everything. But the other thing that I think, and Aurora has really brought this up, is that think about what your local impacts are. I mean, I think the question was around, do I use glass? Do I use, cardboard? I think understanding where, unless you own that packaging, or unless there's an element that you want back, like, what is the larger ecosystem in which your business is operating, and what is the local infrastructure support? And that may actually help in making decisions. I think about a movement, and we see this in restaurants in bigger cities, but we also see this in a couple of pilots where the companies are trying to figure out where can they incorporate reuse. So are there mechanisms for, if you were to sort of offer sort of restaurant takeout, for example, could you actually provide silverware that could be reused? Are there take back mechanisms that are local that could support local economies where you could do that, or not, and then what would be the lowest environmental impact approach that you can take? Because one of the things, as was said earlier, things are constantly evolving, things are changing, but also, it's important to know what is it that is within your purview and your control. And sometimes there just may not be a lot. And so then that's really an opportunity to look at what is the least bad impact that I can have. If the option of like, how do I make something better and regenerative is not available to you, really thinking through what are the trade-offs that I'm willing to live with, and how do I potentially move the needle forward in terms of my sustainability efforts. So that's, I think, where I would think of, don't be afraid to be innovative and to understand the context in which you're operating.
Yeah, that is also important. And, Aurora, I keep, forgetting, because you're in Georgia. Yeah. Is that right? So yeah, I mean, the infrastructure that you're going to get there, as opposed to New York or San Francisco or Boulder, Colorado, where, I mean, they've got compost next to the recycling, next to the trash on the streets. And it's like, you're just not going to get that everywhere, not yet. And, where the role that individual organizations, even on a local level, how they can play out and trial new things. Well, I hope that, I found this really inspiring. I'm not seeing questions come in at this point, so I do want to take this opportunity to guide our attendees to information about our other sessions. I'm just going to put this in the chat here. We have a session coming up next Thursday, August 5th. My goodness, it's August already. Can you believe this, people? It's August. We've made it to August. Good job. That is going to be on green business certifications. And then another follow-up on sustainable supply chains, but the resiliency of sustainable supply chains. It was a rescheduled event that's going to get bumped to the end of August. And recording, so this has been recorded, and we will put the video up on live, so you'll have an opportunity, or on YouTube, and we'll put the link on the website, so you'll have an opportunity to follow up. Any final words? Oh, actually, here's one other thing I wanted to mention. Apologies, this is what happens. I start thinking about it. Last week, we had a great conversation about the reporting frameworks that impact investors use. And to me, the connections here, they're just so clear, right? Like companies, you know, they get to have control over some elements of the work that they do, and the partnerships that they have, and the choices that they make, supply chains, partnership, you know, sourcing, anything. And there are opportunities to track that. There are ways to track this. There are ways to align with stakeholders that share your values. And so I encourage those of you who are interested in that topic to kind of pop back and take a look at last week's conversation. We'll put it up on the website soon. Oh, we do have here, this is a question that I think for both of you would be great. Kelsey asks, I'm a marketing student. I was wondering how someone working in a larger organization could help influence the business they work at to partake in a more sustainable behavior. All right, Aurora's got her hand up, but Verena, let me toss this to Verena. Do you want to jump in first?
You know,
No, you can let Verena go first and then I'll go.
There you go.
That is a really important question, and I think a difficult one, because it really requires, for companies that are larger to make changes, require buy-in from the top. Where you have buy-in from the top, you are able to move a lot further and faster. There are a couple of different ways to approach it. One, you can think about, like, you know, getting internal support at different managerial levels, or maybe at a departmental level, to sort of pursue green initiatives within the company. And to the extent that you can demonstrate that those green initiatives are either saving money or improving morale or having some kind of a benefit of the company to the company, that's one way forward for helping to build a case for management support. Now, if the company is like a massive, massive company, really, I think hopefully they have a sustainability team, but if they don't, beginning to sort of engage with the environment, health, and safety teams, which companies of that size should have, and just asking questions, you know, figuring out where are the inroads for making progress. The smaller the company, the more opportunities they are, the more nimble, the more people wear different hats. But the number one way that you can really get companies to commit to systemic improvement and change is to get buy-in from the top. And again, understanding and being aware of the larger issues that are out there, by educating yourself on the reporting frameworks that are being used to the investor and to the public communities, figuring out like what is being said in a sustainability report. Do they have one? And being aware of the larger market trends and what competitors are doing can best position you to sort of begin to make that case. And so there's a lot of learning to be done, because there's often somebody down the road in the company doing this kind of work, and understanding where that lies. And then also the other 50% of the battle is getting internal alignment and approval, and everybody sort of marching in the same direction. And that can take a long time. But knowing the art of doing that is a powerful skill, because that's how change gets made. It looks easy from the outside, but when you see companies setting net zero targets or coming up with sustainability plans, that did not happen overnight. That was often years in the making behind the scenes. So it's not an easy lift necessarily. I hope that helps.
Aurora,
Well,
you want to build on
I
that?
would second all of that, because basically everything you just described is what I walk students through in my green team course. So, this is like a topic I'm so excited about, because 120 students have taken the course and started green teams at their companies. And it ranges from small little nonprofits to global companies. And I've seen them start green teams in call centers. I've seen them in hotels, restaurants. I mean, just like you name it, it's crazy. Churches, like all across the board, people are starting green teams. And it's all about exactly what Verena said. It's not about, here's a checklist on how to start recycling at your company. I can point you to that, but it's all about how to have a conversation with people who may be resistant. We do role play on how do you overcome objections. We go through step by step on how to build the business case, understand who the stakeholders are, why they matter, how to approach them, just all that sort of like internal relationship, change management stuff that's required. And what I find is that sustainability is really, it's catching on. It's just, especially in larger corporations, there's sustainability departments, and it's the purview of this small group of people, and all the other people kind of who are interested in it feel like, well, I don't have permission to touch that. That's not my job. And they're just waiting on permission to do something, instead of kind of stepping out and like Verena said, just asking the question. So I completely echo that. It just starts with asking the questions, building the confidence. One of the first assignments my students have to do is learn what their company is already doing in sustainability. And the vast majority of them come back with some form of, I had no idea we were doing this, which goes to show that those things tend to live in a report somewhere and not necessarily on the ground where people get to participate in them and celebrate and enjoy them every day. And so I think from all levels of the organization, we have to democratize the role of sustainability and empower and allow every level of the organization to raise their hand, even if it's just like, can I just start a little green team in my department to turn off the computers at night? Sure. Right? Just to allow those little things. And then I think people just start to feel more and more empowered and part of the solution.
So I guess to maybe push it, because I'm curious, if I were a young worker at a large organization, and I admit I've never worked for an organization bigger than 35 people, so it's a whole other world for me thinking about like working for the Coca-Colas and the Amazons. What would you say to someone looking to do that? Where do they start? Do they go to their manager? Do they go with that idea to turn off the lights at the end of the day?
I start with their span of control, because I know, especially as a college student, their span of control is going to be very limited. And in fact, one of my students worked at a distribution center for Amazon, and one of the initiatives that he got them to do is they had these like wood pallets that they were tossing. Like every day they were tossing, and he introduced this idea of like, why don't we, like, they degrade over time, but let's toss them every 3 days instead of every day. Like, just think about the impact of these small decisions, just a part-time worker in a distribution center, right? So I think it's really about what's your span of control, what do you observe, and building relationships and just starting. And that's where all of the, because the course that when I run it as a college course, their grade isn't dependent on actually doing anything other than a procurement audit, because a procurement audit only requires a search engine. And I can't guarantee that they'll be able to start recycling or food waste reduction or anything, because I don't know what their span of control is, but I know they can research. But inevitably, every single one of them does some change in like how they slice the meat to reduce food waste, or, like, hey, I noticed we get these bagels and we throw them out, and this is the way we throw them out, and when we throw them, what if we did this? Little teeny tiny things that make them feel so empowered because they could actually drive a change if they just kind of raise their hand. Now, obviously, sometimes those hands get slapped down, and I try to help them build confidence and encouragement and, get over that. But I think it's really just, what is your span of control? And let's start there.
And I would add to that one effective way, especially if you're newer to the organization and you're earlier in your career, or even if you're not earlier in your career, if you're interested in these issues and it's not in your current purview or your work, potentially putting into performance goals, a professional development opportunity that you're interested in this space and you'd like to see what this company's about, that allows you to get mentored by people who are over in that particular side of the house. It gives you a reason to make a connection and to have a relationship with those people. And that's your in. And then if you're able to sort of maybe help out on a project, and then maybe like, not that you would transfer divisions, but if you make it very clear that you're looking to benefit the overall organization and you're looking to grow your career in a particular area, taking time to learn from and be connected to those folks on that side of the house can prime you for opportunities to eventually move over or be an asset to them or learn from them and figure out where in your sphere of control. And I'll give you an example. For example, if you are new to your career and you're working in the procurement division, being connected to the people that are in the environmental and sustainability group to learn what they're doing can be incredibly valuable to them, because if you stay where you are and you take that knowledge and help be a conduit of information to your managers, so that managers in that side of the house are hearing about sustainability from different levels, procurement is often where a company can have the most impact in terms of its environmental input. You don't have to be wearing the hat of an environmental sustainability officer to actually be making the most impact. So sometimes where you are is where you can have the most impact. But if you signal as part of a professional mentoring conversation with your manager that you want to grow your skill set, that can be the impetus for allowing you to interface with other parts of the organization.
Well said.
I love it. Well, we are coming up on time here. Any final last words? You've been so inspiring, both of you, in terms of just sharing ideas and sharing thoughts. And I hope that the founders and those kind of, in whatever organizations that they work in, are also inspired to kind of make change where they are. Any final words, things that we maybe didn't touch on that you want to make sure you get a chance to share?
The one thing I would add is make sure that you leverage professional and industry associations, especially if they have a green committee. Volunteer to be part of that and learn what the industry is grappling with and how you can help to innovate. And that can help with job search, right? Maybe somebody else on that committee will hire you away because of your interest in sustainability. But also in terms of partnerships, right? Sustainable SDG 17, the Partnership for the Goals. There are nonprofits. There is a nonprofit focused on any issue that you could find in your supply chain. There's a nonprofit somewhere out there that is doing the research, or an academic or institution, someone somewhere is doing the work that you would like to move forward and advance. Learn from them. They have free resources, white papers, webinars. Call them, talk to them, especially for the founder audience here and the smaller, growing businesses. Partner with the people who've made their full-time job how to eradicate slavery out of supply chains. That can't be your full-time job. Your full-time job is to make a candy bar or a computer or whatever it is you're doing. You need to let other people do what they do, but partner with them and learn about their initiatives, their pledges, the agreements. Find out everything you can from them, and that will fast track some of your research.
Awesome. Thank you. Verena, any last words from you?
I think just the takeaway is no action is too small. It all makes a difference.
It really all does. It all does. Thank you. Aurora, Verena, you guys have been amazing. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us this afternoon. And like I said, I really hope that everyone attending really found this as inspiring as I did. We will have the recording up on the website probably by the end of tomorrow. I'll go ahead and send it out to everyone who registered, but please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. I am at innovationlab@bethesdagreen.org. My name is Patty Simonton. Happy to answer all your questions about the programming that we do here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thanks, Patty.
Bye.
Thank you.